Hi guys, welcome to another Raw Talk session with me, Dolly Indigo Star. Today I have a special guest with me, author and science fiction writer, Duncan Lunan. I've travelled up here to Scotland to see Duncan, to talk in depth about a couple of the books that he's wrote, because you've wrote about 10
That's
in
right.
all. And there's one in particular that captured my imagination and beyond, and it's this one. It's Children from the Sky, that is about two children in Woolpit in East Anglia, down there at the bottom of England, and these two children have caused a phenomenal amount of controversy, I will say. Where do we start? Duncan, the Green Children of Woolpit.
Okay.
What brought you to write this magnificent book?
Right. As far as I'm concerned, the story begins back when I was a student doing my degree is in English and philosophy, backed by physics and astronomy and French. I was sitting the history paper of, I sat all four history papers when I took my degree, and it was the second one covering the period up to William Shakespeare, essentially. And one of the set texts was The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton. Published in 1613. He was primarily writing a medical textbook. There were, in the Everyman edition, which I had then, it was 3 volumes. It was a massive piece of work, because in it, as he covers each medical topic, he also covers everything that is known in relation to that topic. He was a Renaissance man, and back then it was still possible to know everything, in theory at least. And right in the middle of this 3-volume work comes what he calls a digression of the air, which is his chapter on astronomy and meteorology. And right in the middle of that comes the great throwaway line. He's talking about the planets being inhabited and the feasibility of interplanetary travel, because Kepler has shown that it could in theory happen. And then you get this great throwaway line: it may be that those green children which fell from the sky that Newbrigensis writes of in his time came from thence. And Newbrigensis is William of Newburgh, who was considered to be one of the particularly reliable sources of information for the 12th century in his history of English affairs. And also the same story is told, but from a completely different viewpoint, by Ralph of Coggeshall, the Abbot of Coggeshall in Essex. He was writing from the viewpoint of the children being alive, or the girl being alive as an adult. And William of Newburgh interviewed witnesses to the children's arrival. He was trying to be a ghostbuster. He was trying to discredit miraculous events because he felt there were far too many being reported. And he couldn't explain what was it about this one. He said he felt, miracles are supposed to illustrate some point of scripture, and he could see no point to this. But he said, I have interviewed so many witnesses, and witnesses of such quality, that I have been convinced that this wondrous event occurred. And it's not my business to tell God what to do or not to do, so I'm putting it down here. He then goes on to 3 other incidents after it, which he attributed to bad fairies. And then at the end of it, he says that explains them. But as for those green children, he says, I just don't know. There's a great line. He says, let each man say of this what he will, which is one of his favourite expressions. But I have no regrets about having set down this most strange and wonderful event. Now, what happened was at the village of Woolpit, 8 miles east of Bury St Edmunds, at harvest time, in somewhere in the second half of the 12th century, which I think I've pinned down, 2 children came out of the ancient earthwork from which the village of Woolpit took its name. And they spoke a language nobody recognised. They wore clothing of a colour and material never seen before. And both of those are extraordinary. You get people saying, oh well, villagers those days were so isolated. Well, they weren't. Woolpit was an aspiring market town on the principal, what was then the principal pilgrim route in England. Foreign, not just travellers, but foreign travellers.
On a coastline?
No, it's way inland, but people from the coast, from Ipswich, coming through on pilgrimage to Bury St Edmunds would have been passing through all the time.
So it was a trade route, part of the trading route?
Yes, and yet they didn't recognise the language and had never seen the clothing, which already it's remarkable. And the other remarkable thing, and another remarkable thing, is that William and Ralph are telling the story, as I said, from different viewpoints, with different vocabulary. Very unusual for medieval chronicles. Usually, if you get the same remarkable event in 2 chronicles, one's copied from the other, but not in this case. And the crucial thing is they were green, and coloured green all over. And it is emphasised that it was bright green, and it was all over, of the whole body. So their skin, their hair, everything, their eyes, well, at least
mouth, inside their gums,
all of that. I talked to a professional conjurer about this, and he said back then there would have been travelling players, mumming plays or what have you. He said when the church investigated this in depth, as they did, they would have checked all the less obvious places, like the inside of the ears and other orifices.
Okay, personal parts.
When indeed it looks as if the girl in it, particularly to begin with, was treated quite roughly before common sense prevailed.
Okay.
But they were put on public show, and the show was to demonstrate that they were coloured green all over. So they obviously were not well treated at first. But at any rate, the thing is, they were taken to the home of a nobleman called Richard de Calna. Another anomaly. De Calna was no ordinary knight. He's described in Ralph's Chronicle as a sort of knight.
A sort of knight? Yes. What sort of knight?
A certain sort of knight. Well, that's the thing. People have been assuming, because he is so hard to trace, that he was a masterless knight, a sword for hire, and a young man who hadn't yet found a feudal overlord. And not a bit of it. He's very hard, as I said, he's very hard to trace. It was my cousin who finally tracked down a record of him in Norfolk, from which I was able to work out on and get the rest. He was born no later than 1116, and this event, I believe, happened in 1173, so he was already at a good age for the time. But the thing about him is, he was the youngest son of a family of very prominent churchmen. His father was Royal Treasurer and Bishop of Ely. Okay. His grandfather was chaplain to William I. His great uncle was Chancellor of England, regent to Henry I and Bishop of Salisbury. His cousin was Archdeacon of Lincoln, of Leicester, and later Bishop of Lincoln. His uncle was the Bishop of Norwich. It goes on like that.
Okay, so there's a bit of an interest in these children from people of quite high status.
Well, there may have been a bit. We'll come back to that one. But the thing about it is, how did he get to be a knight?
How did he get that?
To be a knight, you had to be the eldest son of a knight, unless you got a battlefield promotion. So where was he? There is no record of him at all in the civil war between Stephen and Matilda, although other members of his family were very much involved. Suggests he was out of the country. And although it's circumstantial, what seems very likely is that he was on the Second Crusade, along with particularly the contingent from Hastings. The significance of that is they used to do the financial records of England in form of what they call pipe rolls, because they were parchments stitched together and you rolled them up and they looked like a pipe. It was de Calna's great uncle who had initiated that when he was Royal Chancellor. After the Civil War, it took 2 or 3 years before the custom was, before things calmed down and they started keeping records again. The very first entry in the very first pipe roll after the Civil War states that Richard de Calna and Richard de Hastings, who was by then the Master of the Templar in England, had excused all taxes on the grounds of their extraordinary service to the Crown. Now, that is very unusual. You might be let off one tax or another, but to excuse all taxes makes you invisible. De Calna simply vanishes from the records, except that now and again he witnesses a family charter. But for the rest of his life, he's effectively invisible. He's M. He's the head of the Secret Service.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the ancient British Secret Service.
Yeah. He lives next door to Richard de Hastings, who's the English Master of the Templars. They each had knights in service to them on each other's land, so that they were in constant communication. And putting it all together, I reckon that de Calna was knighted during the Second Crusade by the de Hastings who was leading the English contingent and was a Templar, and I think that's where you get it. De Calna was married and had 3 sons, so he couldn't be a full Templar. He'd have been a married brother, a frère marié. But that...
A bit like a Freemason.
Well, a little bit, yeah. But the thing is, to loop this back around, the thing is that the villagers took the children
to
him, crossing the land of 2 senior barons to get to him, so they knew where they were going. De Calna wasn't by any means trivial. He had at least 15 and probably 23 knights in service to him. He was actually a vavasseur, which is intermediate between a knight and a baron.
So was he given both children?
Initially, yes.
To take care of guardianship of these 2 children. So a Knights Templar had been given these 2 children to take care and guardian of.
You made an intuitive jump there, but I think yes. At any rate, they went to him and they stayed with him. And given what happened next, I think you're probably right about the guardianship, because Henry II, this was expected. Henry II had already annexed the village of Bury St Edmunds from the church. And as people say, oh, he did that all the time. Well, I haven't found another instance, and I've looked long and hard. But even more to the point, Henry said that he'd done it because he had a poor clerk who needed the income of £10 a year, which is in the Domesday Book and continues from there. Now, the man he entrusted Woolpit to was Geoffrey Riddle, who was Deputy Chancellor. He was responsible, among other things, for entertaining foreign royalty at his own expense. This was a man who thought nothing of paying £10,000 for a single banquet.
Wow.
Then,
think
how much that would be now. He was not stuck for a tenner. And it's it's more and more obvious that something big was going on. But in 1173, which was an unusual year for quite a number of reasons, but this particular one was that was the year Henry's sons and his queen rebelled against him, all except the future King John, who hadn't got the bottle. And it was over the fact that Henry had promised to make his eldest son king, to abdicate, to atone for the murder of Becket, and he hadn't done it. and they weren't going to wait. The family wasn't going to wait any longer. Now, Normandy aligned with the rebels, as did at least half of the barons in England, and the King of Scotland. Henry really had the dice stacked against him. Leicestershire actually rebelled openly. It was the only county that did. But Henry was over in Normandy defending it against France. And suddenly, at the end of July in 1173, he broke off and dashed across the Channel for 4 days. And there is no record of where he did, where he went. He didn't go to any of the seats of power, London or Winchester or any of those. He didn't go to any of the war zones, and he didn't go anywhere, as far as you can tell. He didn't pass any acts or sign any charters.
He just disappeared.
Yes, but his expenses, even the King of France, his enemy, remarked on it. How does he do it? But his expenses were met by the Sheriff of Northampton, so he was somewhere in the...
He was in the vicinity.
In the vicinity. And what happened was 300 crack troops who were Templars were put into the castle next to Wiltburn.
How interesting.
For no apparent reason. So it very strongly suggests that Henry went to see the children and thought, well, we knew something was going to happen. Perhaps the lid is coming off hell. And he put these boys in to take care of things. 300 crack troops to guard a village of 100 people. Yes.
So 300 troops to take care and guard this village with these children.
Who are now at DeCalna's place up on the boundary with Norfolk.
So do we have any ages of these children?
Only that they were children and the girl was older. But I think from what happened you can put dates on them. The girl was a real survivor. She took the initiative all the way along. And it ended up, if I've identified her correctly in the record, she ended up marrying one of Henry's senior ambassadors after a period running at least one of DeCalna's estates for him.
Okay.
And the boy, on the other hand, died of depression. And that's curious because at first they wouldn't eat any food. Very remarkable. You think about it. If they were strays from the tribe in the woods, if they were taken to the home of a baron and told they could eat anything they liked, they'd have thought,
be eating anything.
Wouldn't they? When the bean harvest started, which would have been around about the end of July, they recognised the colour, but didn't know which part of the beans were edible. But for a long time, they wouldn't eat anything else.
But beans, green beans.
Which is something that people suffering from depression are told to avoid.
Interesting.
They contain a compound called tyramine, which accentuates melancholia. And the boy died of depression.
Bizarre. And is there traces of a burial for him, or is there records?
Well, no. We have to go through a few hoops to get there. But let's go on to what happened next. It says in both chronicles, they lost the green colour. They learned our manner of speaking, and it seemed to the wise that they might be christened, and even that was done. That's the emphasis. And then both accounts, written quite separately, go into formal Latin. And where modern translations read he said and they said and she said, what it actually says in Latin is gave evidence or swore an oath. So I rang a chap who had a degree in, a diploma in theology and Catholic law from the College of Cardinals. And I said to him, what's that about? And he said, everybody knows that. I said, sorry, I don't. And he said, well, even today, a christening in the Catholic Church in controversial circumstances must be preceded by an inquisitio, which is a formal hearing conducted by a bishop. So immediately, with the amount of research done by that time, things fell into place. There was only one bishop in the frame. The abbot of Bury St Edmunds couldn't do it, he wasn't high enough ranking. The Bishop of London was the superior of Coggeshall Abbey, where Abbot Ralph wrote down the story relating how de Calne visited him frequently when the Green Girl was grown up. And so it comes to the bit in the hearing, and the children are asked 4 questions. The first is who and from whence they were. And the reply is, we are people of the land of St Martin.
So let me get this right, Duncan, just for a minute.
Yeah.
These children, I'm saying children, have been found, and they are like taken to a trial, a kind of trial.
Comes later. There's about a year in between. Yeah.
So there's huge controversy over these children and questioning where they've come from. They're put in front of a council of people.
Well,
the king?
No, it would be the bishop. We don't know who else, but.
So they'd have been taken to the local priest. I'm gathering the local bishop.
Maybe briefly, but no, it's bigger than that. They wouldn't have brought in the quote local bishop, because that was the bishop of Norwich, who was trying to exert control over the village of Woolpit at the time. So the abbot of Bury St Edmunds would not have wanted to approach him. But the superior of Coggeshall Abbey is the Bishop of London, and he's the guy. He's very much the king's man. He's a strong supporter of Henry in the Becket affair. And the thing is, the children said, we are people of the land of St Martin. And everyone else has been, in modern times, been taking this to be the name of where the place they came from. But it's not. The land of St Martin is the Essex property, or was the Essex property, of the Church of St Martin's le Grand, which stood next to St Paul's, under the Bishop of London, and was the principal sanctuary in England. So
sanctuary, that's a place where you're safe, where you can seek safety.
Yes.
So these kids were taken to a place of protection.
Yeah. They're under,
to be protected under the king's watchful eye.
Yeah, the bishops particularly. But the thing is, the Church of St Martin's le Grand was the only permanent sanctuary in England. Everywhere else it might be 40 days or what have you. But if you were under their protection, you were under protection for good. And when the bishop says, who and from whence are you? The reply is not whence, it's who. Who are you?
Who are you?
We are under your protection. Yeah. As, of course, he knew perfectly well. It's a formal process. Now, the second question is very strange, unless you're reading between the lines, because he says, do they believe in our Saviour there? And
what would that mean?
Well, it's to put it on record that they are Christians and not heathens.
Do they believe in God where you come from?
Yes.
That's what they were asked.
That's what that is. And the girl basically replied, you can't see the place for churches. So,
okay.
And as an adult, she dropped that. She never mentioned it in adult life.
What did she mean by that?
It's just a cover story. Yeah, she says, oh yes, the land is full of churches and they're all dedicated to, they're all Christian. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the third question, and this is where the story really starts, as the goons used to say. The third question was, does the sun rise or set there? And all they had to say to be safe was yes, because it was believed in that time that there was no sun in fairyland. And they couldn't bring themselves to lie, and they said no. And launched into a description of life in a country of permanent twilight, separated by a broad river from a country of permanent sunlight. They're talking about a planet with a trapped rotation, a planet keeping the same face always towards its sun. It's not Earth, it is very definitely not Earth. And Burton knew enough Renaissance astronomy to realise that was the case, and that was why he put it in his astronomy section. He said they fell from the sky, although they actually
fell from the sky.
Yes.
So,
Brings us to the fourth question.
it brings us the fourth one.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Which was, how did you get here?
How did you get here?
Now, as an adult, the girls said they wandered through a network of caves and came out at Woolpit. Not true. The Woolpit stands on Pleistocene clay. In that time it was like Ely, it was virtually an island surrounded by marsh. Even today the water table's within 3 feet of the surface. Medieval houses in Woolpit didn't have foundations, they were built on
So it
rafts.
would have been boggy, it would have been water, it would have been...
Yeah, there are no caves.
Right,
There's no
okay.
rock.
It's clay.
It's clay.
It's all clay.
Very wet clay at that. So, what initially they said, as children, was that in both accounts it says it happened to them because they were out with their father's livestock on a certain day. This is very precise in Latin. It's causative. It would not have happened if they hadn't been out that day. They should not have been out that day.
Okay.
They heard a great sound.
So they were somewhere they shouldn't have been that day.
They heard a great sound of bells, like the sound of the bells at Bury St Edmunds, and it's quite specific. It was like the sound. People have elided that and said they heard the bells. And
so they heard some kind of bell.
They heard a ringing noise,
which would have been
probably an alarm.
An alarm. That makes so much sense.
The next sentence says, after which suddenly, as if placed in some absence of mind, we found ourselves in the field where you were reaping. Instantaneous transfer. And very interestingly, notice the girl not only knows what amnesia is, she knows she hasn't got it. She's not from a primitive background.
So she knows, that says to me, that rings alarm bells to me, that was some kind of teleportation.
Very definitely.
Through a portal of some kind.
Yes.
She knew that she had been transported instantaneously. Yeah.
Yeah. We may as well talk a little bit more about that, because people
do.
A lot of people said to me, medieval chronicles are full of incidents like that. So I looked at all the medieval chronicles I could lay my hands on, and with the resources of Glasgow University Library and the Mitchell and the National Library of Scotland, that was most of them. I only found a handful of cases of people appearing and disappearing. As G.K. Chesterton said, disappearances are harder to account for because the family ghost is only keeping up appearances. Yeah, in this case, but appearances and disappearances, there are very few cases. And when I looked into them, I found something rather remarkable, which is that of the sites where these things happened, I'm going the wrong way.
It very much sounds like alien abduction, like an ancient alien abduction that's going on, or transportation system, an experiment of some kind that went wrong.
Very much so, and the further we go into it, the more apparent that will. The point about it is that the few incidents we have of people appearing and disappearing are happening in straight line corridors.
Okay.
The sites are all north-south.
A pattern.
Yes.
North to south.
Yes. Three parallel bands across the British Isles. And the sites at which they happened, the dots there, are all under the control of just 6 families, with 3 families at the centre of it. It looks, if you look at the history of any one site, just like the Brownian movement of property in medieval times, because That's how you moved up and down in society, was by exchanging property. But it's not. That what is happening is that these families are swapping control of these sites between them and not letting anyone else in.
Interesting, they're guarding them.
Yes.
Almost as though they're protecting and guarding what's there because they know.
So, yes, something we're looking at the tip of an iceberg with this accident with the children. It's part of something very much bigger. We've already seen that the king is heavily involved.
It's a bit of an ancient modern conspiracy. If it was put into today's lifestyle, it would be a conspiracy that's going on, really. Somebody being protected by the king and people being involved and people appearing and transportation, tales of just instantly appearing.
And yet it's hidden in plain sight. Any churchman reading the Chronicle at the point when the narrative shifts into formal Latin would immediately, in the context of the christening, would immediately know that this was an inquisitio carried out by a bishop. And the reference to St. Martin would immediately tell them it was the Bishop of London. And knowing that he was the king, one of the king's right-hand men, would tell them it was the king's business and they'd better keep out of it. So, yeah, it's the best technique for concealing, hide it in plain view. The more you go into it, the more evidence you find of this. The thing was, among other elements of it, that with the appeals that were being made to the Pope to intervene in the matter of the village, and the church and the village, the Pope decided he'd better do something, and he wrote.
So the Pope was contacted as well?
He was, yes. And the whole story of how he was contacted is obviously a cover job. The guy who went to see the Pope was clearly working on behalf of the king. He subsequently became abbot of Bury St Edmunds, and I don't think that's any coincidence. But the Pope then wrote to the abbot who was in place, and he said, as regards the Church of St Mary Woolpit, and by implication the village, I have given orders that the king is to return it to you when he's finished with it.
Interesting.
So the Pope knows something.
He knows something.
He knows something. Now, Sidney Jordan, illustrating this scene, you've got the trial. He's dramatised it. I mean, he's got it happening by night for a start. This is almost certainly in the church adjacent to Coggeshall Abbey, because children weren't normally admitted to Cistercian grounds. But you've got the Bishop of London, the boy's answering a question, the girl's looking on very anxiously, and over here, along with the scribe who's taking it all down, you've got two black friars, either Dominicans or, let's see, who were the other ones? Was it Gregorians? Anyway, the point is there were no black friars in England at the time. These are papal observers.
Okay.
They've come to see what happens.
Like the watchers that
and
are
of course,
watching.
remember, if the bishop, there's no chance that it's going to happen. This is all obviously been prearranged. But if it went wrong, the children would be burned as productions of the devil. They'd be sold, judged to be soulless. So
what were they trying to work out with these children?
They had to put it on record that they were Christian and had souls, so that they could not be destroyed.
And this was because of their colour, the colour that they appeared in.
Yeah, and the whole set of circumstances. I mean, it's to eliminate any suggestion of witchcraft, of the devil's involvement. They've got to be on record as human, and quite significant.
So
you've got de Calner with his hand on his sword here.
Yeah, it's kind of fate, really, is it?
He wouldn't. Well, it's a modern picture. Sidney Jordan did this, but de Calner would not have been allowed to bear arms in church. nevertheless, you know.
So he's like protecting them, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's protecting these children that are pleading their case.
Well, let's just get this right, boys.
Yeah.
This all figures, but if she's who I think she is, she married Richard Barr, who was de Calna's godson, as far as I can establish. Certainly they were like that. And the godchildren usually took the godparents' names, and they're both Richards. And so was almost everybody else, but nevertheless, I think that's the case. Circumstantial evidence again, but there's good reason to think that
she married his.
Well, so, yeah, it all fits together. De Calna's cousin at Lincoln probably introduced him to his fellow I've lost the word. The Archdeacon.
Okay.
Yeah, his fellow Arch. He probably introduced. I'll start that sentence again. De Calna's cousin at Lincoln, whom he would have had to approach for permission to go on crusade, because you needed to back it with your family's property to do that.
Okay.
It wasn't a cheap thing to go, especially.
Okay.
Yeah. He probably went to see his cousin and said, "Is this all right with you?" And his cousin probably introduced him to his fellow archdeacon, who had just had a baby son. And his fellow archdeacon, suitably impressed by the young man going off on crusade, said, "Would you be godfather to my child?" And so, Richard Barr. It all follows. Again, the evidence is circumstantial, but it ties together, and it gets to the point where Richard Barr is in the right place
at the right time,
exactly the right time to be put in charge of Woolpit when this all breaks. And if that's who she married, she is called Agnes and has no surname. She has when women were widowed back then, they reverted to their maiden name.
Or it was the area, or what trade, or family.
No, specifically. De Calna's granddaughter married a man called John Fitzbernard. When he died, she went back to being Sibylla de Calna. And that was the usual practice. Agnes didn't. She remained Agnes Barr after she was widowed and all the way up to her death.
So she didn't have a name?
She didn't have a surname. And the bit that does it for me is that St Agnes was the girl they couldn't burn. She was to have been burned to death in that martyrdom, and the faggots wouldn't light, so they had to behead her. I can just picture de Calna and Richard Barr walking out of the hearing going, "That was close, we'll have to call her Agnes."
Wow.
I think that's it. So, now,
did she live then, or was she beheaded?
Well, St Agnes
was
beheaded centuries earlier. Yeah.
But she was named after?
After, yes. Yeah, she's very definitely not a production of the devil. She's named after a saint.
Yeah.
And she's been christened.
Definitely light.
So now we come back to your question about the boy's body.
Yes.
Now, although children weren't allowed to be admitted to Cistercian grounds, it is conceivable that Henry ordered the Bishop of London to have the boy buried, and he did it in the cemetery of Coggeshall Abbey. And the reason for saying that is that a couple of years later, another extraordinary episode occurred. I couldn't believe it when I went down there researching this, and I went to Coggeshall, and my attention was drawn to this. The custodian of the barn of the abbey, which survives, said, "I've been looking through our own records, you might find this of interest." And my jaw just dropped when I read it. What happened was, the chap who was in charge of the guest house was locking up for the night before dinner, and to his astonishment found it full of Templars. And he recognised them as Knights Templar. He said, "What are you doing here?" And in fact, no, before he had time to say anything, the leader of the Templar party said to him, "What's happening about our dinner then?" And completely taken aback, the servant said, "Well, guests dine in hall with the other brothers." No, I beg your pardon, I got that the wrong way round. No, he said, "Guests dine with the abbot in his quarters." And the leader of the Templars replied, "It is not our custom to dine in private. We eat in the hall with the other brethren," which is part of the rule of the Templars, that the master may not eat in private.
Okay.
So he's just revealed himself to be a Templar master. And these guys are in the guest house, and this was all investigated afterwards. The guards at the gate were absolutely positive nobody had passed them, in or out. They were last seen rushing to the cemetery, and they disappeared. They didn't leave by the gatehouse. And again, that breaks another rule of the Templars, because it was just thought a Templar climbing over a wall would be up to no good. They're forbidden to do it. They must enter any other house enter and leave by the...
So do we think that they were burying the boy?
I think more likely they were retrieving him.
Retrieving him?
Retrieving his body.
Taking him away so that he wasn't there and nobody would find him.
Yes, it makes you wonder what he might have been wearing or carrying that he was
or
buried
why
with.
did they want to take him?
Well, suppose there's a key to the matter transmitter.
What do you mean, Duncan?
All right, it's some sort of identification that
so if he had a chip in him,
or something around his neck.
Okay, he was wearing something.
We've got a picture at home done by an artist called Sue Jones, and she painted the boy with a medallion. And when I asked her why, she said it just felt right. Anyway, that's suppose that is the case, and he was buried with it, and it can activate the matter transmitter, which is going off by accident.
But that would kind of make sense.
Very dangerous underground.
When we look into kind of science fiction and that kind of theory of transportation, they would have to have had something to activate these crafts.
Yeah, something for the system to latch onto at least. Now the other thing about 1173 was that for most of the 12th century, the sun was very disturbed. Chinese and Korean records talk about...
Siamese?
Naked eye sunspots.
Okay.
And huge auroral displays, red aurora all the way down into Syria.
So that would have caused a huge magnetic disturbance on the Earth and with the people in general as well.
So the thing is, a planet with a trapped rotation wouldn't have a magnetic field. So I went to a physicist and said, imagine a matter transmitter linking a planet with no magnetic field and a planet whose magnetic field is being seriously disturbed by the sun. And 1173 was the peak of those events. And can you figure out what's going on? And he said, oh yes, tell me what makes it go wrong and I can figure out how it works. And he came back with a description of it. And the way it works, and obviously we're in the realms of speculation here, if getting really far out, but his description was of mission control on a space station orbiting the children's world, or could be any world, but probably that one. And what you do is you alter the spin rate to change the artificial gravity, and you alter the electric charge on it, and you wait, and on some Earth-like planet, conditions will momentarily match, and the portal will open. So, like in Stargate, you shove a milk through so that it can be opened from the other side thereafter, and retune and open another one somewhere else. You could end up with a lot of Earth-like worlds linked by
So
the
we're
system.
saying that these kids possibly arrived by jumping a Stargate.
Yeah. Or the Stargate grabbed them is more like it.
That's a bit far out, Duncan, for like 1200 AD something.
Well, it's obviously not of human manufacture. One of the curious things about it is that there is no description anywhere in the story of any non-human beings, except for one incident in 1205 at Maidstone, which is not on any of the corridors.
That's in Kent, isn't it?
Yes, it's not on any of the corridors, which may mean it's not part of the story, but it's the other details seem to fit. There was a big lightning storm with one huge bolt of lightning during it, after which a certain monster was found on the ground. And it's the Latin grammar. It's a certain monster. It's as if the chronicler knows what sort of monster. Yeah.
They know what monster, a certain monster.
Yeah. It had the head of a horse, the body of a man, and extraordinary limbs. Now, as the late Jack Cohen used to say, he was a biologist who gave a lot of advice to science fiction writers, he says the big giveaway in films and TV is knees and elbows, because the aliens are being played by actors, and all their knees and elbows are in the same place, as all four-legged beings on Earth are, because we're all descended from a fish called Gogonassus, and their knees and elbows are where the fin joints were. It says, but unless all the aliens are descended from the same fish, they are not going to have knees and elbows where we do. Their arms and legs are going to be different. And this creature had extraordinary limbs. And the smell of its burning was so nasty that nobody could get near it till it went out, which suggests a different body chemistry, doesn't it?
Well, the thing that fascinates me most about all of these things that you're telling me is that it's not fiction.
Yeah.
It's real.
Yeah,
These were really, really recorded and documented, and they're just not talked about. But putting them together in today's timeline, this sounds to me like extraterrestrial visitors and teleportation and stargates and advanced technology.
I think we can go a bit further. We can go into motivation. The thing about the green colour, more explanations have been suggested for that than you can shake a stick at. And the most common one still is supposedly a disease called chlorosis, which turned young women green.
Okay.
Now, nobody actually had a patient to whom it happened. They all knew somebody who knew somebody who had a patient. Yeah. But in fact, it's these days it's listed among the diseases that never existed. There is not a word about it in Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy for a start, nor is there anything about it in Aristotle, who was one of his
I've never heard of it,
Yeah.
that anyone's...
Well, it turns out that it was a disease of young women in industrial society in the late 18th century. And it was actually a catch-all name for a whole bunch of nervous conditions, including anorexia nervosa.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of the medical textbooks of the time that do mention it say quite bluntly, the cure for this is marriage. Yeah, it's the green sickness.
Oh, okay.
In that
They described anorexia as green.
Yeah, that and other related conditions, which are essentially sexual tension. Yeah, and
Interesting.
frustration.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's not.
But it wasn't. These kids
It's not.
spoke an entirely different language that they were not just bilingual. You were saying that they were trilingual.
Well, they would have been if Agnes ended up running estates for de Calna. And this takes you to another thing in the Chronicles, that when Ralph was visited by Richard de Calna, and he was talking about her, she was in ministerio predicti militis, in the service of the aforesaid knight.
Okay.
And everybody, including Glenn Maxwell in his very good play, Woolpit, they all assumed that this was domestic service, that Maxwell has her scrubbing floors. Yeah. But it's not. In fact, medieval manor houses did not have female servants. It took me a long time to find this out, because it's one of these things historians assume everybody knows. But I did eventually find one that said the medieval serving wench is a Hollywood invention. In fact, the servants were all male. Ministerio is administrative service. She was running things for the Carna. And if she was, she would have needed Latin to talk to the priest and French to talk to other knights and barons, and English to talk to the workers.
She must have had to be in a very matter-of-fact woman to take care of all of those affairs. She must have been very intellectual and very assertive to be able to see the full running of all those kinds of things.
And to marry someone like Richard Barr. Another favourite explanation is that the children have been living rough in the woods probably all their lives, which we've already established isn't the case, but that they had iron deficiency, which turned them green. Iron deficiency does not turn people green. In fact, turning green is only one thing that does, and it's acute retention of bile products, in which case turning green is a sign of imminent death. But the children demonstrably were not in that condition.
No, they lived.
They lived. But the iron deficiency one keeps coming up. But the other great symptom of iron deficiency, which is genuine, is that in childhood it severely impairs mental powers. And you think, well, if the girl spoke in adult life, spoke 3 languages and ran estates, after her intelligence was stunted as a child, what would she have been like otherwise?
Wow, so what I'm thinking now is that she managed to not just adapt, but she learnt to decipher languages really quickly. So that shows to me that she wasn't sick and that her mental capacity was very above average for her to be able to learn that quickly.
What I keep thinking of is a couple of episodes of Star Trek where the characters have to pass themselves off in some relatively, shall we say, culturally impoverished circumstances. There's one where they go into an alternative universe, which is still pretty much a barbarian ethic. And the counterpart of Kirk, both played by William Shatner, who does it well, it must be said, he gets twigged straight away on the Enterprise, and the real Enterprise, as it were, and put in the brig. And when Shatner and Nimoy and DeForest Kelley get back, they find that this is the case. And this is after they've been passing themselves off successfully in the other universe. And they say, why did you catch on so fast to the other guy? And Spock says, it's very easy for a civilized man to pretend to be a barbarian, but a barbarian cannot pretend to be civilized.
Interesting.
So,
interesting response.
Well, applying that to the girl, she's actually from a higher culture.
Yeah. So she knew how to adapt straight away.
Well, she could, that's the thing.
Yes.
She could act, being a noblewoman in medieval England.
Yes.
A noblewoman from medieval England would probably not have been able to get by in her world.
And being given such power as well, and status and positions of power, political power.
It goes back actually to something you said about the guardianship.
The guardianship, yeah.
She was not a royal ward. I've checked thoroughly. There are detailed lists of who were royal wards. Dekalna's granddaughter became a royal ward when she was orphaned. But Agnes isn't there, and there's nobody else that could be the Green Girl either. So if the king made De Calne her guardian, it wasn't official in that sense. But I think it ties in with something that needs accounting for, which was that De Calne told Ralph of Coggeshall that she was wanton and lascivious.
What does that mean?
Basically sexually free. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a liberated woman, as we would say.
Okay.
Which
which meant that she could be sexual with anyone she pleased.
As it would seem.
That's unusual for a woman in those times, is it not?
Yes, it didn't do your reputation. You didn't just have your
reputation. That's what I'm saying. It wouldn't be. That would be more of a status of a queen, I would say, to be. When you look at Isis and Ishtar, and Inanna especially.
But the thing is, when she reached the apparent age of 14, if De Calne was her guardian, he would have been obliged by law to find her a husband, unless she was unchaste. And there he is at Coggeshall, and he would have to provide her with a dowry, which in those times would have been family land, his family land. So and by then he's an old man, and maybe just got a bit mean in his old age.
So did she have children?
Yes, she had the illegitimate child plays perfectly into that scenario, doesn't it?
Yes,
it allows him to say of course she asked for it. So yeah, yes, child. Me too. But she eventually married Richard Barr, and that didn't happen until. Let me think. That didn't happen until 1190, after De Calne's death, when nobody could stop her. But she had a legitimate son as well, or one who was made legitimate by that marriage. It's quite funny what happens next. Richard Barr took responsibility for the illegitimate child. He went up to the north of England and bought land for him to take when he was 14, that being the age of adulthood then. But he didn't stay there. He came back to where he grew up, which was with Richard the Barr family's neighbours in Staffordshire.
Okay.
And there was land there, which one way or another he ended up with, and the Barr family wanted it back. The legitimate son went to court over it, and the result was inconclusive, and in due course he died. Agnes was quite an old woman by this time, and the grandson took up the case, and he was winning the case. It was going his way, and in the middle of the trial, the illegitimate son said, "I swore never to reveal this, but I don't suppose it matters now. I am actually this man's uncle." And of course it stopped the case dead. Because if he was a member of the Barr family, even an illegitimate member, then he'd got the property at least for the time being. The Barrs did eventually get it back, but just picture the scene when the grandson got home and his granny said, "How did it go in court today?" And he said, "Have I got news for you?"
Yeah.
But the point is about it that Agnes had no idea all that time that this contentious next door neighbour was actually her son, her illegitimate son.
How amazing.
She rejected, what it tells me is she rejected the child.
Wow. Which
backs up the idea that it was the product of rape. So yes, when I first came up with all of this, or other people came up with it and put it to me, I thought we're in Game of Thrones territory here.
It kind of does, doesn't
it? But when I checked through Henry II's movements on the year before the illegitimate son was born, immediately before Beltane, he was staying at Richard Barr's place.
Well, it's interesting because there is kind of a naughty word that we all know, and it's it kind of relates back to all of that, for under consent of the king, fornication under consent of the king. If we shortened that, that's what it was, and it meant that he could take any woman that he wanted, basically. But people use that word now in latter terms for casual.
But the thing was that the kings of that time were generally very good to their bastards. I mean, I'm descended from an illegitimate son of Robert II of Scotland, who set up his sons, legitimate and illegitimate, all around the country to look after things for him. Henry II was extremely good to his bastards, to the extent that on his deathbed, the only one standing by him was his son by Rosemary Clifford. And Henry said of him, "He has proved to be my true son. It's my legitimate boys who are the bastards." Henry made sure that all his sons were looked after. I don't know about daughters, but all his sons were. But he assigned this one to Richard Barr's care.
This one to the care of Richard Barr.
Barr was an extraordinary character. He was deputy to John of Oxford, who was the senior ambassador. And at the age of 19, he was authorised to negotiate viva voce with the Pope on Henry's behalf in the Becket affair. And the Pope wrote a letter to Henry II denouncing him and all his works. And in the middle of it, breaks off and says, "From all of this I exempt our dear son Richard Barr, who has laboured so tirelessly on your behalf." And yeah, again, I've talked to experts, and this just plain didn't happen. The Pope isn't going to say that this teenager is something special unless he is something special, very special. And yeah, as I say, circumstances in the rebellion put him in exactly the right place and with the right legal background to take over the Grandchildren affair.
So we have, in a nutshell here, a story that's not really a story, that's a fact, that became kind of mythical down the line because people have added little bits into it that, stories of some say they come out the woods, some say they came out the earth.
Well, they did come out of the earth. But not from inside the earth.
So we've got a huge thing here with these children that I would say that are extraterrestrial myself.
Well, their parents probably have been abducted from Earth. And from
hybrid children.
Not even that. No, there's no.
Not even that.
No. They lost the green colour and were perfectly normal, and
they came back to normal.
Yeah, it's just vegetable dye, and I think it's probably camouflage. I think that's the simplest explanation here. But there's lots of questions that remain unanswered, of course. The sun has not been so active since. Does the matter transmitter disturb the sun, or does it only work when the sun is disturbed? Hard to tell. Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays I think one, and Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays I think the other, and on Sundays I don't know. Yeah,
there'll always be a different theory.
Yeah, but the thing is, the sun has not been so active since, and the story stops in 1366. There's a last flurry of incidents.
So do you think that there's a huge connection with galactic alignments, sun activity, to do with Earth activity, stargates?
Yes.
And galactic alignments and portals.
I can scarcely believe it, but that's what we appear to be looking at. It's the X-Files in the 12th century.
It's the real X-Files.
Abductions for experimental purposes with the connivance of at least some of the terrestrial authorities. It's the X-Files.
That is astounding.
Isn't it?
Duncan Lunan, thank you so much.
Pleasure.